Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Well, it's a tremendous pleasure and honor for me to meet and talk to both Cynthia and Wendy. I've enjoyed your books enormously. They gave me great pleasure and also great excitement because you have revealed with these two women that you've written about things that I absolutely knew nothing about and gave me a completely different slant on the two the two seminal people in both Buddhism and Christianity, which is the Buddha and Jesus Christ. And you have both illustrated and portrayed women who were not only very, very close to the Buddha and Jesus, but who were absolutely important and is extremely important in helping them bring about both their ministries, their dispensation. So I might go to Wendy first. You actually called Mahaprajapati the most important woman in Buddha's life. And all we knew about her before was that she kind of took over when the Buddha's actual mother died just a few days after he was born. That's all we knew, that she was a kind of stepmother. But she was so much more than that, as your book reveals. And she was like his real second mother, she may not have been the real birth mother, but she was actually the mother figure in Buddha's life, but so much more. Because you also say she was the second most important woman in Buddhism after the Buddha himself. So please, could you just give us a quick rundown of why she was the most important woman in Buddha's life and why she was the most important woman in Buddhism after the Buddha? I wonder if you could just give us that would be lovely if you could, Wendy.
Sure. Yes, thank you, Vicki, and it's wonderful to be with all of you. Absolutely. We know so little about Mahaprajapati Gautami, who was the Buddha's adoptive mother. And I found in my research that she was such a key figure, not just throughout his life, but in the founding of his ministry. So we get both pieces. We get this theme of deep mother's love and a deep relationship between Mahaprajapati Gautami, who literally took the baby Siddhartha Buddha to her breast and began to feed him when his birth mother Maya died. So it was really a seamless transfer between the two mothers, who happened to have been sisters. And there's even a beautiful Khmer poem about Maya when she was on her deathbed, giving the baby to her sister to raise and to hold and to nurture. And we've lost that profound piece of the loving mother when we hear and learn about Mahaprajapati Gautami. And there are not too many stories of her mothering him as a young child, but the stories we find, she was deeply, just as committed and deeply in love with this child as any mother is with one's child. I like to take the step out of mother, and I like to take the foster out of mother. When I talk about Mahaprajapati Gautami, I think of her as his mother. He had two mothers. He had Maya and he had Mahaprajapati. I think of them as co-mothers who just were present at different times in his life. But throughout his life, and also when he was about to leave home and he was so distressed, we see stories of a mother who is deeply involved in that process of separation and anxiety, that he's leaving always with concern for him, not for herself, which to me is typical of a mother. She was worried about him, not about herself. Without that kind of attachment, it was really great love she felt for her son. And then later, when he was founding his ministry, She was right there. She was, as leader of the Sakya women, as the queen, she brought the women to his teachings as lay women. And that was part of his commitment when he assumed, when he became enlightened, was to teach lay women and lay men and nuns and monks equally. And then later she brought the same cohort or group of women to him for ordination. And the whole last chapter of her life is about teaching the Dharma. And I think of her, when you really read the stories, as co-creator, really, of the Dharma and of the Buddha's ministry.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. Maybe I can switch. I'm going to try and do this alternatively rather than do a whole section on one author and then a section on the other. So if I could go to you now, Cynthia. Yes, you did an amazing job. I mean, we knew much more about Mary Magdalene, those of us who were brought up in the West and in a Christian tradition. We knew much more about Mary Magdalene than we did about Mahaprajapati. But what we knew, I mean, I was brought up partly Church of England and partly Catholic. But what I was taught always was that she was the fallen woman. You know, we used to giggle about this because they wouldn't actually say the word prostitute. The nuns wouldn't anyway. But she was definitely the fallen woman who Jesus redeemed. And you brought out, of course, that has recently been, she has been taken away from that terrible title. So I wonder if you could say, why do you think she was branded in this way for so many of us, for so many centuries, indeed millennia? Do you have a reason why she was called this fallen woman?
Male angst, short and simple. You could make it much more complex, but right through the history, even beginning in some of the stories buried in the Gospels, and then particularly in the extra-canonical Gospels called the Gnostic Gospels that we've been getting back, you see that her depth of spiritual understanding and her depth of strength were as threatening, if not more threatening, to the male disciples than her clear spiritual closeness with Jesus. And so they were even beginning by the time of not long after Jesus's crucifixion, to dismantle her as well. So the idea itself, the notion that she was a fallen woman, didn't enter the tradition of the church until about 594, when Pope Gregory I preached a sermon on Easter that basically was, he just let his collective unconscious run wild. And you can see how he does it, where he's just associating back and forth and says this woman that Jesus cured all the demons of and all the hysteria and all the trouble has got to have as a primary sin, the P word. So that's where it entered, and it never entered in the Eastern Orthodox Christianity, incidentally, who've always kept much straighter and clearer regarding her as the church's high side has, as the apostle to the apostles, the first one to receive the teaching of Jesus and the first one to spread the good news. So it's only been the Western church that's been, metastatically infected with this concept of her as a fallen woman. And even though it was retracted by the church officially in 1969, you can still go into almost any church on Easter Sunday, any Catholic church, and hear them still preaching the same thing, that she was a fallen woman. So that's the power of the kind of sublimated, repressed religious imagination that when it's just let out of the box a little bit too far.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there's always been a dichotomy within, certainly within the monastic tradition of both Buddhism and Christianity. But at the moment, Cynthia, about, women within the monastic traditions, women are either pure or they're not pure. You have the Madonna and the whore syndrome within the within the Western traditions. And so, women are obviously a bit of a threat to monastic traditions. And you can either be one or the other, but you just can't be a normal woman, And I wondered how you see, after your research, how you see and saw Mary Magdalene herself, as a woman.
Well, I met her in many ways before, I wasn't a nun myself. I never came through the tradition, and I wasn't raised Catholic. So I didn't get, as it were, preformed in any sort of concept that she was a whore, that she was a fallen woman. So I first met her through some very interesting, through medieval drama, which was my scholarly profession. That the drama was reborn in the West in Christianity when the monks began to reenact that moment when Jesus speaks to her at the tomb. And that's where it took off for them. And of course, in a monastery, they had a man playing Mary. But I could feel even then, my first exposure was the weight of her, what you might call spiritual intuitive understanding. And that I never doubted myself that the reason that Jesus was spending time with her and why she was the one to be entrusted with the first revelation of his resurrection was because she was spiritually perspicacious. I mean, she got it. She was much more intuitive. She was much more on his wavelength than any of the others. So I never had to kind of deconstruct and reconstruct my own relationship to her. It was just a deepening sort of horror as I went through the traditions and saw the ways that she has been deliberately expunged. And I would say that this, and what you've mentioned too, about the either, virgins or fallen women pervading the monastic archetypal imagination, is all part of this deeply repressed, dysfunctional, I would even say pathological spirituality, which in another way in the church is popping right back up again in the pedophilia scandals. The church has never really known, in a rigidly enforced celibate tradition that also holds the power structure, how to deal with integrated womanhood, with sexuality integrated with human creative transformation. It just hasn't been able to touch it. So women have been dealt with, certainly in the by and large in Christianity, and particularly Catholic Christianity, through very, very distorted and immature archetypes of women, which in turn stem from their own distorted relationship with their own sexuality.
Right. Well, I think, Wendy, we could sympathize and understand a lot of what Cynthia is talking about within the Buddhist structures as well. But Mahaprajapati also, you said in your book, I was very moved by this, when she was the only one who first got it as well, when the Buddha came back home and gave teachings after he had, attained enlightenment. Could you talk a little bit about the feast and the teachings and her recognition of him then at that point?
Yes, that's a great moment. He had been gone for 12 years, and she had, as his mother, had grieved him very, very deeply. She was worried about him. Of course, there was no email or way to know what was going on with him. She was worried about him, and she was grief-stricken the whole time. So when she finally got word that he was coming home, and he was coming home with, a whole company of monks that were already his disciples, and it was a long walk, they came, it was hundreds of kilometers for him to go home from where he had attained enlightenment and had been teaching. She was overjoyed. And of all the members of the family who greeted him when he came home, she was the most unobstructed in terms of her immediate love for him and her immediate acceptance, if you will, that he was no longer the son who left, but he was now a Buddha. And his father struggled, wanted him to kind of go back into his old role. So did his wife. But to me, really displaying a mother's love, she just saw, into her son as her son, and immediately got that he had attained this amazing state. So one of the wonderful stories is she invited him to the palace, and at the palace, there were the women's quarters where the women lived, and this would, to a certain extent, be the harem, but it was also the women's quarters. And she invited him to come to dinner as her guest. And it was only in the women's quarters. And he accepted. And he brought along a whole bunch of monks. And she had to think about seating arrangements for this huge company of monks. And there's this beautiful, beautiful story about how devotional she was to him. And even though she was the queen, she served him with her own hands, and she tended to all the details of this dinner. And it was just this outpouring of unconditional love, and to me also recognition of what he was bringing forth, which was the Dharma. And as is typical, and I found this in my own life, after you feed a great teacher or a great lama a meal, he gave a teaching. And we get in this particular text, which has many of the old stories, the Mahavastu, we actually get the details of what he taught that night, which to me was thrilling. And so he taught not only her, but the 500, and they always say 500, we don't know how many, women of the women's quarters. After dinner, he taught them their first Dharma teaching. And it included sort of general teachings on impermanence and so forth, which those of us who've taken a lot of teachings are familiar with. And then she got it so immediately, so quickly, that, and he intuited that, that he went on to take her deeper, take all of them deeper, progressively along the steps of the path into the Four Noble Truths and so forth. And she got it. And she immediately attained the first level of realization. And there are said to be 4. And that is an irreversible state called stream entry. And that is named in several texts, but especially in this particular story. And we don't know about the other 500 women, but we can only imagine that they had similar experiences. So it was a very profound encounter, this first meeting with her son. And this sets up this fact that she attained this immediate connection with his teachings and attained this level of realization. This sets up really the rest of her life, because she's in her late 60s at this point, or in her 60s, mid 60s maybe. And this sets up the rest of her life, because he comes back at that point, the women begin to learn the Dharma as lay women. And then he comes back home 5 years later. We don't know the chronology, but that's putting together the pieces. And then at that point, she asks, because they're ready, they've already been trained as lay women. And she's been kind of nurturing that, and the preceptor for that as the queen and as the, really the mother to all the women. She asks for ordination because they're ready and they want to take the next step. And there's also a big backstory about how their husbands have left to take ordination. So these women were somewhat bereft and wanted to take ordination as well. So we see this profound, immediate understanding of the Dharma that she got. And to me, it was also an immediate experience of, yes, I feel like I was there. I feel like I got it too. It was so powerful, that story.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I'm going to come back in a moment to the ordination of the nuns. But for both of you, it's where have you, since this, it's really odd that for 2,500 years or for 2,000 years, this material is only now just coming to light of the role of Mary Magdalene and the role of Mahaprajapati. And why do you think it's just revealing itself, emerging now? And where have you got your information from? I'll go back to Cynthia. Your information on Mary Magdalene and this amazing role that she had in Jesus's life.
I think in a way, it has always been there in the culture as a counter story. And you find it particularly strongly in places like southern France.
Yeah.
where there's a very, very strong collective oral memory that she actually landed there. And as you walk around the little churches and grottos and basilicas, they essentially follow a pilgrimage she made from basically Marseille area where she arrived west. And along that, you find any number of churches, shrines, and above that, there's a feeling of gentleness and a teaching of love that culminated certainly and more notoriously in the Cathar tradition, which the church put down, but it culminated equally well in the tradition of courtly love and the greatest poets of Aquitaine in southwestern France. So it's always been there, working in a more humane soil. But I think it came to the fore nowadays because of the convergence of a couple of things, at least. First of all, was the growing awareness through the women's movement that women have been collectively and systemically silenced, redirected, and misconstrued in a male hierarchy. And I think it's taken the emergence of concepts that have come from the women's movement to understand that and see it so clearly. Sometimes you just can't see what's right in front of your face because you're looking at it through old dirty windows. So that has helped a lot. People can say, whoa, what is going on here? And there's been a general movement across the church as women have been ordained in more and more denominations to really sort of look at the power structure that created these imbalances in the first place. So that's one force. The other one is the accessibility now, the much greater accessibility of texts that we'd known about before but hadn't had access to, particularly the so-called Gnostic Gospels, but not entirely. The restoration of key texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which went missing many times ago, allow us to see a different story. And in the light of this story, you don't have to say, well, just the Gnostic tradition kept Mary Magdalene alive. You can go back and look at the canonical Gospels through new eyes and say that if you can read through the gaps and the deliberate omissions, her role is all implicitly there in the four canonical Gospels. You just have to see it. So it's been as everything, a mutual leveraging as the one body of insight helps break open the next step for the other body of insight. Very thrilling.
Right. And Wendy, you also dug up lots of fragments of texts and stories, especially the ones written. You gave me a new word. I was very grateful for this. Androcentric. I had to look that one up. And it's really words and outlooks which are written purely from the masculine male point of view. So there were other texts and other writings that you found which were written by the women of their own journeys in those very early days, which I found very inspiring and very beautiful. And also told of their accomplishments, which I'm going to go on to shortly. But yeah, so you also dug those up, but which was, what am I trying to say? Yes, so those women really helped fulfill the Buddha's mission, which was to provide his teachings to monks, nuns, lay men, and lay women. Because many of Mahaprajapati's followers initially were all lay women. And that's what the Buddha wanted to do. And the Buddha himself, he pointed out, was very pro the women. He liked the women and he praised them and wanted to teach them. But he also had opposition from his own male monastics. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
I feel that the most important story never told, that should be the seminal story that people first hear when they say, tell me about Buddhism, is the story not of his life, which is normally, oh, well, he was this, hero who was a prince who left home, that is very androcentric. I mean, the typical story is completely through a male gaze. It's about the solitary male journey and so forth. And of course, I unpack that in my first book completely. But to me, the key story that should be told, which I was able to put together from fragments, the latter half exists in the Pali Canon, and the first half of it exists in some of the Sanskrit and Northern sources. But when the Buddha became enlightened, he spent 49 days processing the experience and kind of coming to terms with what he was going to do with this experience he had just had. And when he left the Bodhi tree and he was about to embark on his teachings, he had decided through his great compassion that he couldn't keep this gift to himself, that he was going to be the teaching Buddha. He immediately became very ill and almost died from the first food that he took. And he was challenged to die by his nemesis, Mara. And Mara said, die, because he was always trying to undercut the Buddha. And the Buddha said, no. And at that point, this is the story that's missing. He laid out his blueprint or his intention for becoming a Buddha. And if this story were told, if it had been told all along, I think all this gender imbalance would not even be here today. But he said, no, I can't die. He was 35 years old. He had just attained enlightenment. And he said, I have a job to do in the world. And he laid it out that his job was to bring the Dharma equally to the monastics, men and women, and the lay population, men and women. So this is the fourfold assembly that he committed to. These days, it's also often referred to as the fourfold Sangha, which is actually sort of a misnomer, because technically Sangha only refers to the monastic world, but it's the fourfold assembly. He committed to that right off the Bodhi tree, and that became the basis for the next 45 years of his teachings. So people say, oh, did he or did he not want women's disciples? Did he or did he not want women to ordain? You know, that's all added later. Those are sort of male laters. That I identify very much with what Cynthia is saying about the male hierarchy and the patriarchal structure that, you know, through especially the monastic world, because they were the literate ones who wrote the stories down, where women began to be erased almost as soon as there was literacy. But if we could go back to that original story where women were always part of his ministry, always part of his intention, not just to learn the Dharma, but to become wise and accomplished, and to then become teachers. All across the four assembly, he wanted teachers, and we have today amazing women teachers, men teachers, monastic teachers, and so forth. This is the fulfillment of his mission. And this is where I think today we need a revival of recognizing equally the gender roles of men and women. And also he was egalitarian in terms of caste too. He did not discriminate, and it was a heavily casted system in early Buddhism. And he taught equally to men and women of any caste. So this is the story that I think needs to be brought back as the sort of the original Buddhist story.
Yes. I think that it's really important to emphasize this, because Mahaprajapati set out, when she first asked to be ordained, and with all her followers, her 500 followers, she checked with the Buddha whether or not women were capable of attaining enlightenment. And he said they were, which I think has been so disputed within the Buddhist hierarchy, why women have been held back and haven't had the full ordination and have had to sit behind the monks as being, you know, inferior in terms of spiritual capability. And this is in the patriarchy, which has gone across the whole, mostly the whole East and West, where we've had just male examples of spiritual excellence held up to us. You know, in the West, it's been God the Father and God the Son. And we've just had popes, we've just had male Dalai Lamas, and it's always been male depictions, really, certainly within the living examples, even if the iconography has produced, you know, pictures of female deities in the East, but we haven't seen actual living examples of female spiritual excellence in authority positions, and until it's getting there, but it's still a long way to go. And I think this is really starts off with the Buddha actually saying, yes, women can attain enlightenment, can attain. And I think, Cynthia, Jesus obviously felt the same thing. As you say, you go into, I like this bit of your book very, very much, when you go into the shark-infested waters, as you call it, of Mary Magdalene actually, in a way, having her and Jesus having a strong relationship together, which was passionate on both sides. And she actually, I think you say at one point, that she actually helped Jesus evolve. So I wondered which is kind of shocking for, I imagine, most church people to actually hear that she actually managed to teach him something. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that too.
Essentially, Jesus had to do a lot of rapid shifting in his inner sense of himself and his mission when he met Mary Magdalene. It was also to set up in the text that he was going to out John the Baptist. He was going to grow in that model and be a solitary desert ascetic. And of course, the first thing he did after he received his baptism in the River Jordan was to go out in the desert for 40 days. I mean, it was all following the same kind of, if androcentric, is that what you call it, model?
Yes, androcentric.
Yeah, of the way the solitary male pursues the path. And then bang, who knows how and why the first meeting, but he's suddenly in the presence of the Mary Magdalene, and he knows, I think instantly in that moment that it isn't going to look quite like the plot as originally written, and that his life was going to be lived in the tension between old style prophecy, the old Ezekiel's and Jeremiah's, and something new that was much more geared toward healing, towards exorcism, which is the other part of it, that I think that Jesus actually knew a lot more about the shamanic traditions, as we call them today, than the church is willing to credit. That he knew how to work with the earth. He knew how to work with the earth-based knowledge of healing. And again, there are clues for that all through the gospel, but that we don't pay attention to because we just pass right by him when we tell the story. He did everything because he was the Son of God. Mm-hmm. But I think Mary Magdalene basically called Jesus to the path of kenosis, or substituted love, rather than the path of prophetic clarity and judgment. I mean, she was the one who actually flipped him into what he was on earth to do, which had been predicted by the prophet Ezekiel. I will take away your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Well, he had to go through that in his own personal life. Mm-hmm. And out of that, he learned and he forwarded a path that doesn't have anything to do with, celibacy or male entitlement or hierarchy, that as the heart bends and learns to surrender and learns to be gentle, which it can do in any tradition, spiritual enlightenment is attained. It's not exclusively reserved for male celibates. And I think that this is what Mary Magdalene helped him to see. She weaned his path away from the John the Baptist models to uncharted waters that we have not yet to take him up on fully.
To me, this whole discussion we're having here today is about refinding the balance between masculine, feminine, in both in ourselves and in the world at large, and particularly within religious institutions and foundations. Because before the patriarchy, it was the time of the goddess. And I used to live in Malta, where all the temples, these fabulous ancient temples and stone circles and everything, were to the goddess, We called her the fat lady. She's very common within the Mediterranean and in certain parts, but she was absolutely worshipped. And she came before, so it was the goddess, first of all, it was the feminine, which was worshipped everywhere. And then the patriarchy came in, and then it was all masculine. And I think today our challenge is very much to kind of find the balance between male and female. So it's not just a kind of a ricocheting thing between first it's the female and then it's the male and the other's suppressed and everything. And I think that's what Mary Magdalene was very much exhibiting and demonstrating. And I hope more and more comes out about that. And I'd like to actually ask you both now what you think individually, the strengths, what the feminine. Of course, the feminine doesn't just apply to we're on tricky gender ground now, unless all this woke thing, you're not allowed to say male and female anymore. But anyway, I'm going to have a go at it. So what do you think that the feminine brings to the table of spirituality and indeed to the world today of, increasing happiness, generally happiness and lessening suffering? And what does the feminine have to offer? I'll go to Wendy. Wendy, what do you think the feminine has to offer?
No, that's a great question. And I think I found a lot of the answer to that in my research. I could feel the ancient goddess traditions sort of percolating through the stories, and the stories that felt older, there was more presence of the goddess in the sacred feminine. And then I sometimes would find the same story told in what I would say a later version, and all the goddesses and all the female presences were replaced by male. What I think we've lost in erasing the women and the feminine aspect, and I'll use that word also in Buddhism, is also the relational models that the women brought forward early on. It was not the solitary journey to enlightenment that the Buddha is portrayed as having undertaken. It was a relational journey, and the women were always finding potential and possibility as a collective of women, and they found power and strength and support among themselves. And that is a theme that begins from the moment you meet. Mahaprajapati is more or less the leader or the most familiar of the women, but the whole journey, her whole life, from the time she became queen to the time of her death was in this sort of within this relational assembly of women. And in fact, they all chose their parinirvana, their death moments together. So I think we've lost that. I think that's something the feminine brings that the male tends to ignore or isolate. I also feel that we see in the ancient stories this sense of the interrelationship or the inseparability of sentient beings in the earth and the natural world. We see the animation of trees, and that's a feminine animation when there's a need to protect or to nurture or to, frankly, further the Dharma, to help the Dharma along. There's a story of the young Buddha meditating under a tree, and normally the sun would move and he'd be in the sunlight, which was of course scorching in India, and the tree animates as a goddess, and she moves the shade to protect him and keep him in the shade, because she's not just protecting a little boy, but she's got her eye on what he's doing, and he's cultivating the Dharma within himself in his own development. So you see the goddesses having an eye on things in this, the imagination of these early stories. And we've lost that sense, and we've lost the sense of the inner relationship with the rivers and with the forests, and all of that is in these stories that I found across the text, especially in the texts that seem to hold more the oral folk or lay traditions. When you get into the more monastic texts, all that gets stripped out and becomes very specifically androcentric. But when the oral traditions were written down, they were written down in many different ways. And the stories that are most illuminating to what I feel was the original way they were told, which always included women in the sacred feminine, and this notion of the earth and our, in the inseparability of ourselves with the earth, I feel come to us today more intact through those stories that were recorded directly from the oral traditions without going through what I call the monastic filter. And the monastic filter would say, oh no, let's strip this out and strip that out. You know, it's too much of the feminine, too much of the female. And I agree it's not gendered. I think that the wisdom and nurturance of the earth belongs to all of us. It has become gendered, and I think that's just a tool that we can use, but obviously men and women can cultivate that potential equally.
Yeah. Yes. Cynthia.
Well, I find that actually a much more complex question than it looks on the surface, because I think in the final analysis, it's not about balance, but it's about a fusion at a whole new level in a new structure of consciousness. And, I'm a great believer in, and a great fan of the maps of the evolutions of the structures of consciousness, particularly the one of Jean Gebser, that says that each of these great eras of conscious history have got their unique place. And of course, the earlier days of matriarchal culture were boomerang back by a domination of male culture, which has basically continued up to our day. But it's not just going to swing back to a balance point. What people are really seeing is that we need to step forward into a whole new shared understanding of what it means to be a human being. So one of the two impressions that have been going through my mind as I was playing with your question was, first of all, as I've looked at the women mystics in the Christian tradition and leaders that I've been most gravitated to, the fruit of their work, the fruit of their integration of male and female looks different from almost anything. They can be very, very fierce. They can be as some of them sitting in the desert were as separated and as isolated and as rigid and as any of the guys. But when they come together, there's a kind of holistic profundity. When you look at Julian of Norwich or Hildegard of von Bingen or Hedvig, these brilliant mystics, right down to Teresa of Lisieux, they speak with an absolute authority and power, which is yet gentle. It's not aggressive. It's not brutalizing. It's not rigid, but it's absolutely fierce. And all I can say is it's rounded. And the male and the female are profoundly integrated within their being. Look at Catherine of Genoa, who set a whole city on a different track. These are women. Teresa of Avila. These women are movers and shakers, but they do it in a way that honors and redeems the wholeness of creativity, of nature. And I think that's a foretaste of what we're going to see in the new structure of consciousness as it emerges. I've also seen a lot of women, alas, who fail to make this leap and simply take over power structures, male power structures, and run them just as woodenly and masculinely as the old structures. I've seen this disastrously in the church. The increase in women's ministry has not increased gentleness and tenderness in the church. I wish I could say it has, but until you get conscious at the new level, you just perpetrate the sins of the old hierarchy. And there's so many women that are just power grabbing and structural and lost into the quantitative models. So it's like getting access to patriarchy, if you're a woman, is not necessarily going to cure patriarchy. It's more likely to pathologize you. And I think we have to be really, really careful with this as we move into classic structures of our civilization, which are male oriented and at their end game, and bring to it a voice and a freedom, which now flows more freely through the feminine, because I think it has a natural inclination towards integration more than guys do anyway. But also because since they are the rising force in the structure, there's more momentum there.
Thank you. Wendy, how do you see, no, I'll put it this way. What are your hopes and fears for within the Buddhist world on this gender balancing or this gender issue in the future? Do you see any areas which desperately need revising? I mean, for example, what about the texts which have been written by monastics, for monastics mostly, and yes, or how do you say, how have we improved at all within the Buddhist world, do you think?
I think we have. I think we're on a good trajectory right now. I think that there is an opening to this notion of the feminine that has been lost. I think it's something that's kind of irrepressible. The sources that I found that lends itself to this, well, the feminine has always been there, let me write about it and maybe it will be, it'll help it come back. I feel that there was sort of a blind eye to the literature that contained these stories, just as Cynthia's mentioned, that they were there all the time. I don't even speak all the languages that I've been researching, but I have found these translations. And when these translations first came to the West in, say, the 1800s through the scholarship, mostly of the British men, these texts, many of them were translated at that time, but they were still sitting unnoticed. So I feel like the misogyny or the androcentrism sort of hit twice. Here were the stories, many of them now in English, and that's the language I needed to find them in, but they still were ignored because the male gaze was not seeing them. They were only seeing sort of a reinforcement of the Buddhist story through the male monastic way it had also been told. So I feel that bringing these stories that, I didn't invent, I found them. These are ancient stories that were always there. And I feel they're the way that it was originally told. I feel there's a ripening, there's a receptivity that there wasn't, say, 100 years ago. And I get that feedback from people. I mean, in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's the notion of the terma, or something that is hidden until it's ready to be found, ready to be understood. And I feel that these stories in many ways have been hidden and have been not seen because we weren't ready for them. And I feel we're ready for them now. And I always encourage when I teach the stories, don't just listen to me, keep telling them, keep telling them. I want the paradigm of Buddhism to shift, to integrate now what we've lost, integrate the feminine now into it. In terms of the Dharma centers and the integration there, I still see male dominance a lot. But in terms of the monastic world, I'm not a nun. I can't speak for how the changes are appearing, but I'm very heartened by the organization Sakyadhita, for example, that it speaks for the nuns and for equality within the monastic world. I'm very heartened by the nunneries that are being founded, for example, by Jetsun Tenzin Pelmo, who give equal teachings of equal caliber to the young women instead of dumbing down the Dharma or what they're supposed to learn, which was more traditional. The women were getting the dumbed down version, or they were just chanting, or they were, housed adjacent to a monastery so they could cook and clean for the men. All that is changing. And I think with the tremendous love and support of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa, and many, many male teachers, scholars that I meet, and also other Buddhist male teachers. It's a big battle. Patriarchy dies hard. I think that the monastic women know that better than any of us. So all I know is there's a lot of glimmers of positivity. The Shravasti Abbey in Washington State, to me, is a fantastic example of sort of run by a woman, run by a brilliant woman nun, accomplished author and teacher, and it's also, as I understand it, based on very much an equal gender model. It's not just for women. Anyway, I'm optimistic, and I feel that these texts that I have found, and there's just this many that had been translated to English, although more and more, and you get them through the internet now more. Originally, I had to dig deep in libraries and get library passes and stuff, but more and more translation projects are taking place around the world. And I found some fabulous stories in translations through the 84,000 group that hadn't even been published yet, but I was given permission to use them. Stories of women, women's power, women's agency that come from 2,000 years ago, but they've been ignored. So I think we're ready for them now. And I'm excited about that. And I'm excited to see this work continue through all kinds of different avenues. Certainly not me, just me, but I'm just excited. I think there's a groundswell of interest and excitement around these stories and restoring Buddhism to the original model of what the Buddha envisioned. Which upon his death, he said, I'm ready to die because I feel I've succeeded in bringing the Dharma equally to men and women, lay and monastic. And so he was ready to go. His legacy, he felt, was ready to go. And we're the ones who've messed it up. And I think we're ready to restore what he wanted.
Yes. Well, I really hope so. And I really hope that through these feminine stories and influences happening at the highest spiritual levels, that the level of violence and which still happens throughout the world towards women will decrease. Because I think a lot of the violence, the rape, the murders, and the and the abuse, the sexual abuse, which afflicts all cultures. I hope it will really lessen if the feminine is more respected and admired and loved. And I think this would be really wonderful if we had the teachings of respect for the female and the feminine accomplishments are more introduced into churches and temples and monasteries, and so that it pervades outwards into a world which has more respect. I was very interested, Wendy, that Mahaprajapati, according to your research, did achieve arhatship. And you even said that her, let me get it right, that her death was more miraculous than the Buddha's, which is extraordinary. And I think if that was well known and taught throughout the Buddhist world, there would be much less disdain towards the feminine in general. And Cynthia, I hope that the stories of Mary Magdalene and her absolute, not just her love and devotion towards Jesus, but her also powerful spiritual attainments herself, and the fact that she was being recognized as the apostle to the apostles, that she actually taught the apostles. She was the head apostle. I hope that gets out too, so that it actually balance. Well, we're not allowed to use balance, but anyway, it kind of evens up and gives much more integration between healthy male, healthy masculine, and healthy feminine.
Thank you so much, Wendy, Cynthia, and Vicki. That's really, really amazing. I'm just in awe by the stories that you have told and shared with us today, and also by yourselves, actually, sharing this time with us here today.